Well, good morning and Happy New Year, everyone. 2026, eh? That it sounds futuristic to me. I've noticed that for me, certain years seem more futuristic than others. I think it's the number. Something about 2026 feels futuristic. It's like 1999 felt more futuristic to me than the year 2000. I think it's just something about the way the number itself hits me. I don't know. At any rate, here we are. I'm hoping to get more done in 2026. Boy, I tell you, 2025 was a bit rough for me. I feel so unaccomplished, and there's a lot of things I had on my agenda. I didn't get out to the bush very much last year, and I had a bunch of other things planned around the homestead and more things around music and photography and writing that just didn't really materialize. And then I have to remind myself, gee, Mike, you've been having, like sometimes daily and multiple per day migraines where you used to have 3 in a year. And I've been working on, trying to figure out how to minimize those again and try to figure out if I can see what the change has been, what happened. Because it started at the end of 2024. Like in December, I started having migraines once every couple of weeks. And that was already a massive increase in frequency for me. Again, from 2 to 3, sometimes 4 a year, to suddenly having one every couple of weeks. And then it increased in frequency again to once a week or so. And then I started having them daily, which was initiated by a day where I had 2 in one day. And then I started having multiples in a day. And I'm back down now with, I believe the reason is I've massively increased my sodium intake. I'm down to once every 10 days or so, roughly. And that feels like such an improvement. Even though it's pretty frequent, and it's certainly more frequent than I had previously enjoyed for like the first 50 or the last 50 years, because I've had migraines for about 50 years now. I started getting them when I was 7 or 8 years old, something like that. Yeah, it still feels like quite an improvement. I wanted to briefly touch on a couple of subjects that I'd like to discuss in my next upload sort of thing. Not get too deep into them, but just sort of give an idea and see if I can get some feedback. If anybody wants to give me some ideas or their thoughts on these subjects, and then I'll expand on it a little further. The first one is I've followed several channels for a while now, and they have been touching on the quality of consumer goods and consumer protection, consumer rights, the right to repair, things like that. One is Louis Rossmann, and I think, he's doing, I'm an atheist, I guess, but he's doing God's work. I think, he has a channel where he's basically a champion for the consumer and the right to repair, the right to own what you purchase, essentially, as well. He's fighting against manufacturers that lock things behind paywalls now through firmware, or want to prevent you from fixing your own possession that you've paid for through some sort of like copyright infringement or intellectual property infringement. And another one is Uncle Tony's Garage, which, he's mostly a hot rod guy, but he's actually touched on some of the same subjects as well, and has gotten worked up over things like, I think it's Hyundai, who had some electric brake calipers that when it's time to replace your rear brake pads, they have it locked behind a bunch of electronics that you can't retract the piston in the caliper without some, a subscription. So this is going to be a pay subscription, of course, to a service, and of course some $2,000 or $3,000 electronic gadget like a scan tool or something like that in order to apply the electronic commands to the caliper. Again, the commands come through this software subscription in order to retract the pistons so you can replace your own brake pads. And that was one of the ones that Tony from Uncle Tony's Garage had gotten involved in. He's also gotten involved quite a bit in discussions about sort of rip-off things, overpriced parts that he's been trying to purchase, that he's realized, these things used to be very inexpensive, and suddenly they're very expensive. And on principle, he doesn't want to give the money to the company. He wants to find some alternative. And also just the quality of parts, automotive parts, that he's been getting over the last few years, which is something I noticed at the end of my career, I guess you could call it, before I closed the shop down. Certainly post-pandemic, it was really bad. That's when it got the worst. Through the pandemic and afterwards, I noticed the quality of parts issue, which had never been a big issue for me. I had always noticed, certain brands, I would just learn about them and I would just not purchase those parts anymore. Warranty is something I wanted to steer far clear of. It's just not worth it, because even if it is the part, you've still got to replace it for the customer. You can't really charge them for it if it fails. And yeah, I can get the part covered, but now I'm out time. And not only that, it really doesn't matter. Even if the customer knows that it was a parts failure, it wasn't your fault, the perception at the end is still always, well, we had to take it back to Mike. They don't really, it doesn't register the same way. It still reflects negatively on you. So I wanted to stay far away from faulty quality parts as I could. And so I would just learn the hard way, through a couple of bad experiences, and certain brands were off limits to me. But towards the end, it didn't really seem to matter so much. Yes, there were certain parts that seemed to be always quite good. I never had a big problem with SKF bearings, for instance. SKF seemed to always make a good quality part. That may have even changed in the couple of years since I've stopped working in the shop, but my experience had always been they were good and I could rely on them to be pretty good. Almost no warranty, I don't think, ever on an SKF bearing. At any rate, so I wanted to discuss those a little bit. The Louis Rossmann and the consumer protection thing is interesting to me because it actually gets quite philosophical in a way. We get quite deep into ethics with that one because, he's talking about companies that are actually having people charged with crimes for, I guess it would be sort of intellectual property violations and copyright through their firmware. The people that find a way to circumvent certain firmware, that lock out certain features in a product that they've purchased, or repairing something that's failed and finding a way to fix it themselves, and then, especially if they communicate that to other people, that's where the problems usually seem to come in. And Louis himself has offered financial rewards, pretty reasonable ones too. I mean, I think he's shelled out many tens of thousands of dollars to people for coming up with repairs for certain things, like a procedure, or defending people actually legally. So I think he's doing good work, but some of the arguments that he makes, I can see some flaws in too, or I can see the other side of it a little bit. And so these things create interesting ethical quandaries, which I'm always interested in. Sort of always interested in the ethical quandary. How do we solve that? It's the same thing as the whole government thing, right? How do we solve this complex idea of how to govern ourselves without violating each other's rights or giving ourselves powers that don't really make sense philosophically, that you can't really justify, which is sort of what we do maybe not when we create government, but certainly with some of the powers that government seems to bestow upon itself. It's like, how did you come up with the right to impose that on people? Well, this seems like the perfect time to interject the discussion of government, which wasn't really meant to be one of the topics that I was bringing up for conversation. But in light of the recent Trump administration essentially ousting of Nicolas Maduro, I would like to go ahead and add that to the topics that I'm looking for feedback on in this video for future video topics. Obviously, this is the kind of thing that I would normally comment on, generally speaking, from the 60,000 foot view, not necessarily specifically discussing this particular dynamic, this particular situation, because I'm not as well versed on it as I probably should be or would like to be, but sort of discussing situations like this. How do we, for instance, how do we actually determine the legitimacy of a government? And does not the government rely on, sort of the institution itself? And so how does one government determine another government to be illegitimate and then sort of, invade that country, and pierce their sovereignty in order to do, sort of something like this? How does this differ from, other situations? And, what stops another country, for instance, from determining that, let's say, Donald Trump is not legitimate and is a war criminal or some other kind of criminal based on whatever their metric is, and invading and attempting to extract him, if nothing else than just the sheer military power to do so. Like, really, does this constitute the Andrew Wilson force doctrine sort of example, right? Where the US can do something like that because it can, because it has the actual military might to pull it off. And does that somehow make it right? So, we'll add that to the topic list. Because really that's all that it boils down to, is people imposing certain things on other people. Like, that's the brass tacks of it. And where do you come up with the moral right to do that? How did you square that circle? Highly interested in that at all times. Another topic that I wanted to discuss is a modus operandi that I've noticed, and it seems to be more sort of a modern MO. It's something that I've noticed people doing more and more as time goes on. If I look back in time, there's less and less of it. And that is, fuck you for noticing. So the further back in time I look, the less I see of this phenomenon of people just wanting to place a label on another person as a kind of dog whistle to other people, at least in their group anyway, to disregard this person, to relegate them to the scrap heap of human irrelevance. Like, this person is to be rejected. We're all to soundly reject them universally as a garbage human being. And it's the ultimate ad hominem attack, right? Right? Like, it's the ultimate way to not deal with their arguments. And another Another tool that they sort of seem to use, and I'm not even saying it's a conscious tool, it's just the practice everybody seems to be adopting, is not to deal with what the person is saying so much as to just sort of say, fuck you for noticing. And then, of course, apply the label. So the right, a right-wing example of this might be, the whole Palestinian death toll, thing. Like if somebody brings that up, the response is basically a big fuck you for noticing. And they don't contend with it at all. They don't deal with the numbers. They don't deal with the child, the innocent children that have been killed. They just justify, if they're going to make any argument at all, they'll of course justify Israel's right to do whatever it wants to do because October 7, history began on October 7th. But also to do the same thing, to immediately apply a label. Pro-Hamas, right? So you can't speak of the death toll in Palestine without being labeled pro-Hamas, even if you never say anything supportive of Hamas, even if you're not pro-Hamas, no actual arguments are made, right? So the right does it too, for sure. And, a left-wing example of late might be the whole Mississippi daycare scandal thing, the Somali daycare bit. And it's the same thing. It's fuck you for noticing, you racist. So once again, we're not making any arguments. We're not defending anything. We're not contending with arguments. We're just dismissing people to the scrap heap of human irrelevance. And it's just a big fuck you for noticing. And again, I've seen this sort of expanding over time. And it doesn't do us any good, obviously. Nobody is actually engaging in arguments. I saw a news, if it was CNN, no, it was the other, CNN was the other one. I saw a CNN clip. It was a girl there, and I commented on the video that I saw this on. I said, send smarter people, CNN. She was talking about the whole, Somali daycare thing, and they were engaging a professor, I guess, from Concordia University, and she referred to him as an economist. Concordia University economist. And I'm not even sure that this guy qualifies as an economist, let alone an economist, because he didn't really contribute much. He basically just wanted to say the Somali community, gives this much in taxes. It was something like, I don't know what it was. Some terribly low number, actually. Was it 56 million? It was something that if you do the math on the actual Somali population in Mississippi, it's not a number you would really want to use to promote their contributions, because it's actually per capita pretty low. It's per capita, it's pretty low. It's like, I think it's like $1,000 a year or something like that. And he doesn't talk, he didn't list any of the remittances to them, like any welfare payments or any other. So you really can't determine someone's contribution to the economy or to the tax rolls anyway if you don't count both sides of the ledger, right? So what kind of an economist is this guy? And he does the same thing with sort of per capita GDP type of stuff. He doesn't mention any of the remittances back to Somalia that are made. He doesn't mention any of the programs that they take advantage of, like business loans and credits and things like that. And of course, any of the welfare payments that are made to the community. So, he's not really providing much. But there was another one. I can't remember if it was ABC News, perhaps. CBS, another young female reporter. She was confronting Nick Shirley directly. And she announced him as a MAGA YouTuber, which is a dog whistle, right? I think that this is meant to signify to the viewership that this is a guy that you really shouldn't take seriously. You shouldn't take anything that he says to heart, not contending with his arguments. The interesting thing, of course, is that through the piece, she challenges him. She says the same thing, send smarter people. She says, do you know that you are 100% true? Which, what does that even mean? Yes, I am a true human being. At any rate, she goes through all of this, and then they finish this segment by talking about how many indictments there have already been made and how the Biden administration had already been doing work on this situation years ago. And so she basically just confirms that there is some there. And I guess that's to do to finish off their journalism, to not be completely full of shit in just attacking a guy who's doing the kind of journalism that actually news agents, organizations like that used to do, right? But it's still, again, it's another big fuck you for noticing. And that's what the world seems to be these days. Nobody makes arguments. Nobody actually challenges and debates. It's just fuck you for noticing. Here, let me quickly affix this label to you, which will be a dog whistle to everybody, at least in my group, that you are to be discounted, discredited out of the gate. We're not even going to contend with what you say. We're just going to dismiss you out of the gate as a garbage human being, or at the very least, from this time on in the future, people will know, oh, that's just that MAGA YouTuber, and I'm not a MAGA guy, so screw that guy and anything he says. And as you know here, I'm a little bit more of a philosopher than that, I guess. I would count myself a philosopher. I'm not right-wing. I'm not left-wing. I think all issues need to stand on their own merits. All arguments need to stand on their own merits. Nobody's information is dismissed in my book because of who they are. Truth doesn't work like that. Facts don't work like that. Information doesn't work like that. And I wish everybody thought that way, but they don't seem to. We seem to be in this lockstep of tribalism, political tribalism, and otherwise, obviously, ethnic tribalism as well. A lot of people really, it's funny too. So here's another observation for you if you want to comment on this. We seem to be in this era where everybody's engaged in this sort of ethnic tribalism except white people. At least not as a collective. Like there are some groups of white people who, might even be white supremacists, perhaps. I don't know. I think that's another term that's really just a label. It's way overused. I don't think there are that many actual white supremacists, and certainly not practicing white supremacists. No, quite the opposite seems to exist. You can't bring up criminality in one group without some white liberals saying, yeah, but what about the white guys? As though there are no white guys in prison or whatever, But when it comes to a lot of other ethnic groups, certainly people from Southeast Asia and the Somalis and many other groups, of course, they really stick together. They really stand behind each other. When you've got certain guys with a certain common name, Southeast Asian name, crashing big rigs into families and killing 3 people in a single split second from an illegal U-turn on an interstate freeway, you suddenly have, the emergence of TikTok videos with many people from his sort of originating home country, all asking for leniency in his sentencing. They don't even know him. You're just not going to see that with a white guy, right? It's just not going to happen. You're going to have Tim Walz up there saying, but what about the white criminality? What about the white guys? Won't someone please think of the white guys? It's interesting. It's an interesting phenomenon. The idea of the self-loathing white liberal is kind of it's kind of commonplace, like a lot of people have discussed this. It's quite an interesting phenomenon because it's pretty rare actually amongst, different groups of people, different segments of people. At any rate, I'll leave you with those topics to chew on. And those will probably, constitute a few videos over the next little while. It's pretty cold out, so I'm going to put the phone down and let my thumb warm back up. When I hold the phone like this, even though I've got some pretty decent gloves, the thumb gets pretty damn cold. Best wishes to everyone in the new year coming up, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks for watching.